Chapter 3. Those were anxious days, during which I had but little opportunity to associate with Liz. I had given her the commander's room, Bradley and I taking that of the deck officer, while Olson and two of our best men occupied the room ordinarily allotted to petty officers. I made Nobbs's bed down in Lisa's room, for I knew she would feel less alone. Nothing of much moment occurred for a while after we left British waters behind us. We ran steadily along upon the surface, making good time. The first two boats we sighted made off as fast as they could go, and the third, a huge freighter, fired on us, forcing us to submerge. It was after this that our troubles commenced. One of the diesel engines broke down in the morning, and while we were working on it, the forward port diving tank commenced to fill. I was on deck at the time and noted the gradual list. Guessing at once what was happening, I leaped for the hatch and, slamming it closed above my head, dropped to the centrale. By this time, the craft was going down by the head with a most unpleasant list to port, and I didn't wait to transmit orders to someone else, but ran as fast as I could for the valve that let the sea into the forward port diving tank. It was wide open. To close it and to have the pump started that would empty it were the work of but a minute, but we had had a close call. I knew that the valve had never opened itself. Someone had opened it, someone who was willing to die himself if he might at the same time encompass the death of all of us. After that, I kept a guard pacing the length of the narrow craft. We worked upon the engine all that day and night and half the following day. Most of the time, we drifted idly upon the surface, but toward noon we sighted smoke due west, and having found that only enemies inhabited the world for us, I ordered that the other engine be started so that we could move out of the path of the oncoming steamer. The moment the engine started to turn, however, there was a grinding sound of tortured steel, and when it had been stopped, we found that someone had placed a cold chisel in one of the gears. It was another 2 days before we were ready to limp along, half repaired. The night before the repairs were completed, the sentry came to my room and awoke me. He was rather an intelligent fellow of the English middle class, in whom I had much confidence. "Well, Wilson," I asked, "what's the matter now?" He raised his finger to his lips and came closer to me. "I think I've found out who's doing the mischief," he whispered, and nodded his head toward the girl's room. "I seen her sneaking from the crew's room just now," he went on. "She'd been in Gasson with the Boche commander. Benson's seen her in there last night, too. But he never said nothing till I goes on watch tonight. Benson's sorter slow in the head, and he never puts 2 and 2 together till someone else has made 4 out of it. If the man had come in and struck me suddenly in the face, I could have been no more surprised. Say nothing of this to anyone," I ordered. "Keep your eyes and ears open and report every suspicious thing you see or hear." The man saluted and left me, but for an hour or more I tossed, restless, upon my hard bunk in an agony of jealousy and fear. Finally, I fell into a troubled sleep. It was daylight when I awoke. We were steaming along slowly upon the surface, my orders having been to proceed at half speed until we could take an observation and determine our position. The sky had been overcast all the previous day and all night, but as I stepped into the centrale that morning, I was delighted to see that the sun was again shining. The spirits of the men seemed improved. Everything seemed propitious. I forgot at once the cruel misgivings of the past night as I set to work to take my observations. What a blow awaited me! The sextant and chronometer had both been broken beyond repair, and they had been broken just this very night. They had been broken upon the night that Lise had been seen talking with von Schoenvorts. I think that it was this last thought which hurt me the worst. I could look the other disaster in the face with equanimity, but the bald fact that Lise might be a traitor appalled me. I called Bradley and Olson on deck and told them what had happened, but for the life of me I couldn't bring myself to repeat what Wilson had reported to me the previous night. In fact, as I had given the matter thought, it seemed incredible that the girl could have passed through my room, in which Bradley and I slept, and then carried on a conversation in the crew's room, in which von Schoenvorts was kept, without having been seen by more than a single man. Bradley shook his head. "I can't make it out," he said. "One of those Boches must be pretty clever to come it over us all like this." but they haven't harmed us as much as they think. There are still the extra instruments." It was my turn now to shake a doleful head. "There are no extra instruments," I told them. "They too have disappeared, as did the wireless apparatus." Both men looked at me in amazement. "We still have the compass and the sun," said Olson. "They may be after getting the compass some night, but they's too many of us around in the daytime for 'em to get the sun." It was then that one of the men stuck his head up through the hatchway and, seeing me, asked permission to come on deck and get a breath of fresh air. I recognized him as Benson, the man who, Wilson had said, reported having seen Liss with von Schoenvorts 2 nights before. I motioned him on deck and then called him to one side, asking if he had seen anything out of the way or unusual during his trick on watch the night before. The fellow scratched his head a moment and said, "No." And then, as though it was an afterthought, he told me that he had seen the girl in the cruise room about midnight talking with the German commander. But as there hadn't seemed to him to be any harm in that, he hadn't said anything about it. Telling him never to fail to report to me anything in the slightest out of the ordinary routine of the ship, I dismissed him. Several of the other men now asked permission to come on deck, and soon all but those actually engaged in some necessary duty were standing around smoking and talking, all in the best of spirits. I took advantage of the absence of the men upon the deck to go below for my breakfast, which the cook was already preparing upon the electric stove. Lise, followed by Nobbs, appeared as I entered the centrale. She met me with a pleasant "good morning," which I am afraid I replied to in a tone that was rather constrained and surly. "Will you breakfast with me?" I suddenly asked the girl, determined to commence a probe of my own along the lines which duty demanded. She nodded a sweet acceptance of my invitation, and together we sat down at the little table of the officers' mess. "You slept well last night?" I asked. "All night," she replied. "I am a splendid sleeper." Her manner was so straightforward and honest that I could not bring myself to believe in her duplicity. Yet, thinking to surprise her into a betrayal of her guilt, I blurted out, "The chronometer and sextant were both destroyed last night. There is a traitor among us." But she never turned a hair by way of evidencing guilty knowledge of the catastrophe. "Who could it have been?" she cried. "The Germans would be crazy to do it, for their lives are as much at stake as ours." "Men are often glad to die for an ideal of patriotism, perhaps," I replied. "And a willingness to martyr themselves includes a willingness to sacrifice others, even those who love them. Women are much the same, except that they will go even further than most men. They will sacrifice everything, even honor, for love." I watched her face carefully as I spoke, and I thought that I detected a very faint flush mounting her cheek. Seeing an opening and an advantage, I sought to follow it up. "Take von Schoenvorts, for instance," I continued. "He would doubtless be glad to die and take us all with him. Could he prevent in no other way the falling of his vessel into enemy hands? He would sacrifice anyone, even you. And if you still love him, you might be his ready tool. Do you understand me?" She looked at me in wide-eyed consternation for a moment, and then she went very white and rose from her seat. "I do," she replied, and turning her back upon me, she walked quickly toward her room. I started to follow, for even believing what I did, I was sorry that I had hurt her. I reached the door to the cruise room just behind her, and in time to see von Schoenvorts lean forward and whisper something to her as she passed. But she must have guessed that she might be watched, for she passed on. That afternoon it clouded over. The wind mounted to a gale, and the sea rose until the craft was wallowing and rolling frightfully. Nearly everyone aboard was sick. The air became foul and oppressive. For 24 hours I did not leave my post in the conning tower, as both Olson and Bradley were sick. Finally, I found that I must get a little rest, and so I looked about for someone to relieve me. Benson volunteered. He had not been sick and assured me that he was a former RN man and had been detailed for submarine duty for over 2 years. I was glad that it was he, for I had considerable confidence in his loyalty, and so it was with a feeling of security that I went below and lay down. I slept 12 hours straight, and when I awoke and discovered what I had done, I lost no time in getting to the conning tower. There sat Benson as wide awake as could be, and the compass showed that we were heading straight into the west. The storm was still raging, nor did it abate its fury until the fourth day. We were all pretty well done up and looked forward to the time when we could go on deck and fill our lungs with fresh air. During the whole 4 days, I had not seen the girl, as she evidently kept closely to her room. And during this time, no untoward incident had occurred aboard the boat, a fact which seemed to strengthen the web of circumstantial evidence about her. For 6 more days after the storm lessened, we still had fairly rough weather, nor did the sun once show himself during all that time. For the season, it was now the middle of June. The storm was unusual, but being from Southern California, I was accustomed to unusual weather. In fact, I have discovered that the world over, unusual weather prevails at all times of the year. We kept steadily to our westward course, and as the U-33 was one of the fastest submersibles we had ever turned out, I knew that we must be pretty close to the North American coast. What puzzled me most was the fact that for 6 days we had not sighted a single ship. It seemed remarkable that we could cross the Atlantic almost to the coast of the American continent without glimpsing smoke or sail. And at last I came to the conclusion that we were way off our course, but whether to the north or to the south of it, I could not determine. On the 7th day, the sea lay comparatively calm at early dawn. There was a slight haze upon the ocean, which had cut off our view of the stars, but conditions all pointed toward a clear morrow, and I was on deck anxiously awaiting the rising of the sun. My eyes were glued upon the impenetrable mist astern, for there in the east I should see the first glow of the rising sun that would assure me we were still upon the right course. Gradually the heavens lightened, but astern I could see no intenser glow that would indicate the rising sun behind the mist. Bradley was standing at my side. Presently he touched my arm. "Look, Captain," he said and pointed south. I looked and gasped, for there directly to port I saw outlined through the haze the red top of the rising sun. Hurrying to the tower, I looked at the compass. It showed that we were holding steadily upon our westward course. Either the sun was rising in the south or the compass had been tampered with. The conclusion was obvious. I went back to Bradley and told him what I had discovered. And I concluded, we can't make another 500 knots without oil. Our provisions are running low, and so is our water. God only knows how far south we have run. There is nothing to do, he replied, other than to alter our course once more toward the west. We must raise land soon, or we shall all be lost. I told him to do so, and then I set to work improvising a crude sextant with which we finally took our bearings in a rough and most unsatisfactory manner. For when the work was done, we did not know how far from the truth the result might be. It showed us to be about 20 degrees north and 30 degrees west, nearly 2,500 miles off our course. In short, if our reading was anywhere near correct, we must have been traveling due south for 6 days. Bradley now relieved Benson, for we had arranged our shifts so that the latter and Olson now divided the nights, while Bradley and I alternated with one another during the days. I questioned both Olson and Benson closely in the matter of the compass, but each stoutly maintained that no one had tampered with it during his tour of duty. Benson gave me a knowing smile, as much as to say, "Well, you and I know who did this." Yet I could not believe that it was the girl. We kept to our westerly course for several hours when the lookout's cry announced a sail. I ordered the U-33's course altered, and we bore down upon the stranger, for I had come to a decision which was the result of necessity. We could not lie there in the middle of the Atlantic and starve to death if there was any way out of it. The sailing ship saw us while we were still a long way off, as was evidenced by her efforts to escape. There was scarcely any wind, however, and her case was hopeless. So when we drew near and signaled her to stop, she came into the wind and lay there with her sails flapping idly. We moved in quite close to her. She was the Ballman of Halmstad, Sweden, with a general cargo from Brazil for Spain. I explained our circumstances to her skipper and asked for food, water, and oil. But when he found that we were not German, he became very angry and abusive and started to draw away from us. But I was in no mood for any such business. Turning toward Bradley, who was in the conning tower, I snapped out, "Gun service on deck, to the diving stations." We had no opportunity for drill, but every man had been posted as to his duties, and the German members of the crew understood that it was obedience or death for them, as each was accompanied by a man with a pistol. Most of them, though, were only too glad to obey me. Bradley passed the order down into the ship, and a moment later the gun crew clambered up the narrow ladder and at my direction trained their piece upon the slow-moving Swede. "Fire a shot across her bow," I instructed the gun captain. Accept it from me, it didn't take that Swede long to see the error of his way and get the red and white pennant signifying "I understand" to the masthead. Once again the sails flapped idly, and then I ordered him to lower a boat and come after me. With Olsen and a couple of the Englishmen, I boarded the ship, and from her cargo selected what we needed: oil, provisions, and water. I gave the master of the Ballman a receipt for what we took, together with an affidavit signed by Bradley, Olsen, and myself, stating briefly how we had come into possession of the U-33 and the urgency of our need for what we took. We addressed both to any British agent with the request that the owners of the Ballmen be reimbursed, but whether or not they were, I do not know. With water, food, and oil aboard, we felt that we had obtained a new lease of life. Now, too, we knew definitely where we were, and I determined to make for Georgetown, British Guiana. But I was destined to again suffer bitter disappointment. 6 of us of the loyal crew had come on deck either to serve the gun or board the Swede during our set-to with her, and now, one by one, we descended the ladder into the centrale. I was the last to come, and when I reached the bottom, I found myself looking into the muzzle of a pistol in the hands of Baron Friedrich von Schoenvorts. I saw all my men lined up at one side with the remaining 8 Germans standing guard over them.